This was the Bereaved and Survivors Day. Publication of the report released them from legal constraints on commenting. And several families came together for a highly charged press conference in front of a billboard reminding people of the 72 who died on June the 14th, 2017. They could not disguise their anger in the light of the inquiry's findings of systemic fire service failings on training, equipment and policy.
They have no idea what they have done to us. I lost my life, all my family, they lost their life. We lost their happiness. We lost our dreams.
The inquiry's chair, Sir Martin Moore-Bick, in his report said of the London Fire Service, "Some may question whether its training is adequate in the light of experience. Others may question whether it is capable of learning from its mistakes." If there was one thing you would want to see that would guarantee there was never a repeat of Grenfell, what would that be?
I think after the Lucknow fire and now Grenfell, I think it's quite evident to even a child that the whole LFB isn't capable of the jobs they have in their hands. People's lives are in their hands, and it's in the hands of people that are not capable of the job, they're not capable of learning, and they should be discharged of it. There should be other people in charge. I am not happy for a fire to go off in my house and call the fire brigade if it stands as it is today.
London's fire commissioner has taken the flak. She was declared remarkably insensitive by the inquiry for saying she wouldn't have changed anything that night.
That was never intended to either cause offence or hurt to anybody. Clearly, knowing what we know now, we put steps in place immediately afterwards to make changes, and we've continued to make changes.
So you wouldn't do the same again?
Absolutely not, knowing what we know now.
She was asked whether she should have resigned by now.
I don't want to let anybody down. If I was to walk away now, it wouldn't be carrying on. It wouldn't be for me to carry on committing to the people of London and committing to making those changes. And I think if I walked away now, I'd be absolving myself of the responsibility. I'm not prepared to do that.
At Westminster, the finger of blame pointed elsewhere. Grenfell survivors were in the public gallery. The Commons observed a minute's silence out of respect for the tragedy. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson cut a much less rumbustious figure than usual.
And to them, I say once again that the truth will out and justice will be done, and that Grenfell Tower and the people who called it home will never be forgotten.
Grenfell Tower would not have happened, Mr. Speaker, to wealthy Londoners. It happened to poor and mainly migrant Londoners. It was not firefighters that deregulated building safety standards. It wasn't firefighters who ignored the concerns of tenants. It wasn't firefighters who ignored the coroner's report and failed to put sprinklers in high-rise blocks. And it wasn't firefighters who put flammable cladding on Grenfell Tower.
But the stay-put policy at Grenfell was the responsibility of the fire service. And Sadiq Kilbetto, who's never spoken before, attended every day of the inquiry to understand why his sister's family didn't survive. What do you think must happen to avoid any repeat in the future?
የፋየር ብሪጌድም እነዚህ ሰዎች ተቀመጡ ከሚሏቸው ውጭ ሰዓት የታየው ይዝቃጠላ ተቀመጡ ብላቸው እያሏቸው ነው። መጨረሻ ላይ ነው ስንት ሰዓት ሙሉ ሞታችሁ ነበር ግን ውጡ ስላሏቸው እዛው አለቁ።
Today the inquiry recommended that the stay-put policy has to change and urged the following. The government develop national guidelines for carrying out partial or total evacuations of high-rise residential buildings. The housing minister acknowledged today that the most grievous of all the things that went wrong that night was the failure to override the stay-put policy. To avoid another Grenfell, the inquiry makes 11 legally enforceable recommendations. The government said it accepts them all.
Simon Israel reporting there. Well, with me now is Karim Masili, who lost his uncle and is now vice chair of the group Grenfell United, Miguel Alves, who escaped with his family from the 13th floor, and Ahmed Shalat, who lost 5 members of his family. Thanks very much, all of you, for talking to us tonight. Karim Masili, there was a good deal of scepticism about this inquiry, a lot of nervousness about the judge. This is his first report. What do you make of it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jackie. There was a lot of scepticism in the beginning and a lot of confidence that was being taken away from this public inquiry. But we welcome the judge's Phase 1 report. I think it's strong. I think it's fair. And if we implement the recommendations right, we may get some change.
It is damning about the fire brigade, isn't it? And there's been a lot of controversy about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we knew that the LFB was going to be criticised quite heavily. But I think it's important to say that the LFB are not being blamed for the fire, but they need to recognise that they failed on many levels that night, and they need to take these recommendations on board and make changes so that this never happens again. Danny Cotton needs to resign today as the Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade, and we need to...
She has said she's staying on. I mean, what do you feel about that today?
Well, her reasons for staying on is because she wants to implement the recommendations. My thing back to her is, it's fine, you can resign now. We will get someone else in your place that we will trust, that will implement these recommendations for us and for the country.
Miguel Alves, you escaped the tower. We're incredibly lucky. Do you agree with Karim Masili?
Of course I agree, because, you know, the first thing, just they should accept the failures, and now if she fails, then she have to go anyway.
It's been very controversial, the criticism of the fire service, but do you think there has to be that criticism if things are going to change?
Yet I have to praise that, you know, for the individual firefighters, they risk their lives to come in and just try to save our neighbors and our friends. But you know, the management, it was appalling on that day. That's what they create a possibility. I mean, many people die because of that.
Ahmed Shalat, I mean, your family, 5 of them died in the fire. It was acknowledged today by the judge that had the stay put policy been lifted earlier, people might have lived. What did you feel about that?
Well, to be quite honest, I felt the opposite, because to me, the fire brigade is the last thing we should talk about, because we have to concentrate on who started the fire. The most important thing at the moment, the council itself,
the cladding.
And the cladding are operating as normal, like nothing happened.
But that will be dealt with in Phase 2. Why is it important you think that should have been dealt with?
It's time. At the moment, as Karim was saying, the fire brigade, the chief of the fire brigade, not going to resign. Might be a strong case to answer to the report. So it's going to left us with nothing. So we're going to look at the council, the mistake that the council made in the building itself, and the cladding that took 1.6 million, and they're still operating as normal.
And that worries you?
Not worries.
But the Phase 1 is just about the night of the fire. What happened on the fire? I mean, it's not to deal with all the surroundings
of the fire.
The night of the fire. It's a night of the fire.
I think I totally agree with Ahmed to a certain extent. I do believe that we have spoken about the LFB too much, and the narrative has been about the LFB too much, and the whole country is thinking that the public inquiry is blaming the LFB and the firefighters on the night for what happened. And I totally agree. We need to also be asking ourselves how this building was able to be illegal. That's what caused the fire.
The point for all of you is that this must never happen again. Tonight, as we stand here, are you confident this won't happen again?
No, because again, judge recommendations. He didn't ban cladding. They're still operating, and that is very, very serious.
Now, when he says he will deal with that later, why is that not soon enough?
No, please. It's a report. I mean, it's a recommendation, isn't it? If he did suggest that banning cladding, people will take it on board. But he didn't mention it.
Cladding has been banned.
The government has been. Karim, please. There are certain cladding who have not been banned, and the company is still operating.
I agree with you. I believe that the company shouldn't be operating in this country.
Karim, please. The council and the cladding company and whoever and the TMO, please. They still are part of the TMO. All of them are operating as normal.
Do you understand Ahmed Chalat's anxiety about how long this is taking?
Of course, I understand, because it's frustrating that it's taking this long to get to this point. But we have to understand this is such a big case, and the public inquiry and the criminal investigation are working alongside each other. All we're talking about right now is how the fire started on the night.
Just very briefly, I want to ask, what has the waiting been like in terms of what has been the impact on your families?
Definitely, we cannot express it. It's very, 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 very hard for everybody, including neighbors, friends, families, survivors, bereaved. It's very, very hard. Things will never go back to normal. We just need justice.
But it's part of our to heal the pain. That thing, they have to happen. I mean, we have to wait for the inquiry, because it's important they will come out with the truth.
Very briefly, is there optimism now?
Optimism, yes, to a certain extent. We have to remember the LFB have made some errors that they need to change. We need to stop talking about that now, and we need to understand how and why this building was made illegal by companies like Arconic and Celotex, and RBKC as well will have to answer a lot of questions.
On that note, I'm so sorry, gentlemen, we have to end it there. We will talk some more in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what has been done to address the problem of dangerous cladding on the high-rise building since the Grenfell Tower? Ed Hauke explains.
Phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry described the night. Questions remain about the months and years that led there. Phase 2 will examine those causes, and it has implications for hundreds of high-rises in England. In fact, it's taken years of scrambling and investigation by the Housing Ministry to even find the buildings at risk. Month by month since the disaster, statistics have been compiled showing the buildings with aluminium composite or ACM cladding like Grenfell's. So far, at least 435 high-rise and publicly owned buildings have been identified. Cladding has been removed and completely replaced on just 114 of these, and work is ongoing in a further 120. But 201 buildings remain. That's 6 public buildings, 16 social housing blocks, 17 student blocks, 18 hotels, and 144 private residential blocks with combustible ACM cladding in England. And the work to remove it hasn't started on a single one. This leaves buildings with fire wardens and residents in fear. The government has made £600 million available for the removal of ACM cladding. There's still no consensus about why it was placed on our high-rises in the first place.
Well, joining me now is the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, Matt Rack. Matt Rack, thanks very much for coming in. The judge was very specific. He praised individual firefighters for their courage and selflessness that night. But the broader picture is devastating. Inadequately prepared, poorly trained, no contingency plan. It's damning on the fire brigade, isn't it?
It is. I think I would want to echo the points about the firefighters themselves on the night who performed, and I don't use this word often, but they did perform heroically. They put their own lives at risk in impossible situations. But this report has to be an opportunity for fundamental change that we've been calling for the past 15 years.
But in order for that change to come, you have to accept the criticism. And there's a very uncomfortable truth. No one wants to be criticising firefighters. But some of the families believe that individual firefighters made catastrophic decisions that night. And the stay-put policy was catastrophic.
Well, on the question of the stay-put policy, my own union, the Fire Brigades Union, raised the issue of stay-put several years ago when 2 firefighters and a member of the public died in a fire in Hertfordshire. Then we had the Lakenal House fire, and the issue of stay-put was raised with the government, as well as the London Fire Brigade, but government ministers. And I suppose nobody's avoiding scrutiny, but why is the scrutiny only on them, but not on ministers who made those decisions?
Part of this inquiry on the night itself has to be on firefighters who made decisions, senior firefighters who made decisions to keep the stay-put policy in place. And the judge has made it quite clear that if that stay-put policy had been abandoned earlier, some lives might have been saved. That is devastating for the families, isn't it?
And we raised the question, the recommendation on that point is for a government-led review of the stay-put policy, as I'm sure you've read. We asked the chairman of the inquiry last December to issue an urgent recommendation making precisely that demand. Why has it taken from last December until today to make that recommendation? Why has the government waited from the fire itself till today to wait for the recommendations. We could have made those steps in 28 months since the fire, and nobody has done so.
The Commissioner, Danny Cotton, the most senior firefighter on the scene that night, was accused by the judge of remarkable insensitivity after she stood in front of the inquiry and said in front of bereaved and survivors she wouldn't do anything differently to that night. 72 people died. That is beyond remarkable insensitivity. For many of the families, it's offensive.
Indeed, and well, I'm not remotely defending those remarks. So why would I defend those remarks?
Should she resign, though?
At the night, in terms of the comments that she made, every firefighter from the day one of training school is taught to learn from every fire that they attend and to make adaptations and to alter their tactics in response to that. In terms of what the report says is that these are systemic failings, i.e. a failing of the structure, the system, the regulations. And what we want to see is fundamental change to the fire service system that we've been arguing for 15 years against a fragmented fire service. There are no national standards in the fire service. There are no national research. There are no national structures to allow. Who will ensure that the recommendations in this report are complied with? Because there is no structure currently for that to happen.
And for many of the families and the bereaved, it is about somebody acknowledging, accepting responsibility for what happened that night.
And I think the London
and they
Fire
have called today for Danny Cotton not to be allowed to retire at a moment of her choosing, but for her to resign. Do you agree she should do that?
I have no control over what Danny Cotton does. She's responsible for her own actions, and the Mayor of London and the people who employ her. She's not a member of mine. She has to answer for her own actions. What we're saying is that actually one person doesn't create the system. We have to fundamentally change the system that created the conditions that led to the fire at Grenfell.
And when you talk about those conditions, would you say cuts, in your view, played a role?
Undoubtedly, cuts have played a role, but it's more than cuts. It's about fragmentation. And I think the frustration is people are not, the media, yourselves, are not getting to the bottom of what happened here. This is a fragmented system with no national standards. Cuts are a part of the picture. When you get rid of half the fire safety inspecting officers in the UK, as has happened, then how do we seriously inspect buildings? How does the fire service inspect buildings in those circumstances?
The judge has said he is nervous, or he has an anxiety that the London Fire Brigade will not learn the lessons of this, is not ready to change. Many of the families believe the defensive response from the firefighters, Fire Brigade, is indicative of that.
Just to be clear, I don't defend the London Fire Brigade. I suspect I've had more disagreements with the London Fire Brigade than yourself or the judge or anyone else over the years. We've disagreed with them time and time and again. And one of the points, we lose members of the fire service, members of the Fire Brigade Union. And one of the things we've identified time and again is that recommendations are not applied. So yes, we are saying there has to be fundamental change. We've called for that change, as I've said, for many, many years. We are ignored. We hope that this is a turning point. But actually, so far, 28 months on, nothing fundamental has happened.
How confident are you that something like Grenfell Tower would not happen again
I think the worry is that this is why, for us, it's not a London issue. There are these buildings all over the country. The London Fire Brigade probably has more resources than most. If Grenfell had happened elsewhere in the country, we would not have been able to get the resources that the London Fire Brigade was able to get to it. So yes, people are at risk, and that needs addressing.
Matt Rack, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Well, over to Krishna now in Westminster.
Well, here in Westminster, no government minister was available for interview, but I'm joined now by Lord Porter, until this summer the chairman of the Local Government Association, and now its building safety spokesman, and the Labour MP David Lammy, who lost a friend in the Grenfell Tower fire. David Lammy, as you raised in Parliament today, there are people still sleeping in dangerous buildings. People will see government and politicians moving really quickly over certain issues, whether it's Brexit or taking control of the order paper. Why is it that 2.5 years after Grenfell, very little's been done?
It's unacceptable. I mean, in a sense, I can't believe it. I cannot believe that there are people sleeping in their homes tonight in effectively infernos because they should not be around, they should not have that cladding and that insulation. So it's not just government that failed. I guess parliamentarians like me have failed to hold them to account to make it happen, and it's pathetic, it's ridiculous, it's unacceptable.
I mean, because we've seen, you know, how the opposition can take control of Parliament and change the law and do things. Yet there's like a separation between real people's lives
on what goes on in there sometimes.
I do think that the dominance of Brexit has meant that really important things have not got discussed in Parliament. And in a sense, Theresa May said this would happen. Boris repeated it would happen, but it's not happened. And I just find it staggering. I mean, even in Barking, there was a fire not so long ago in a building that should not have gone up in flames. So I'm very frustrated, and I'm sure that many of the survivors are deeply frustrated with where we are on this subject.
Lord Porter, I mean, we are only sort of halfway through, if you like, sort of assessing what went wrong.
From my point of view, this is the wrong way round. The report shouldn't have concentrated on what went wrong with the fire brigade. It should have concentrated on what went wrong with the building. As you've seen by the figures that have been bandied about, this is a national problem. It's everywhere in the country. It isn't a specific London issue. And the first part of that report, just dealing with what happened on the night of the fire, doesn't get us to the solutions that we need to get to for the whole country. And we should have really been concentrating on that. As we're still talking about the ACM cladding, it's not just ACM cladding, it's the insulation that's there, it's the fact that fire doors don't keep fire back, it's the fact that there are other types of cladding that are as equally dangerous as ACM.
But to know what to change, you also need to know what and who did things wrong. So was it, in your view, failure of local government primarily to enforce building regulations, or is it the failure of central government to have the right rules?
Building regulations isn't a local government issue now. It's been subcontracted out to the private sector largely. So we do some, the private sector do some. So there's no point in concentrating on the inspectors. Both councils and private inspectors have got the wrong buildings signed off under their control. The numbers on the buildings, at least from a council perspective, all of our buildings are now stripped. We only had 45, I bet it was 45, out of the total that we've got wrong. I mean, there are over 12,500 high-rise buildings in this country that we don't know the condition of, every one of those buildings.
So can you trace this back to the behaviour of central government?
It goes back, not making
we're in a deeply political moment.
Trying to make
people decide
but the
who to hold to
good thing
account.
with this, on the basis of what the public need to know, this started in 2006. That's when the seeds for this problem was first sown. There was a fire in Manchester and the building regs were changed. And ever since then, building regulation changes have made it more and more complicated for people to understand what is and isn't in the regime to be used. The tests are not valid anymore. The type of tests they do on the products doesn't stand up to modern living. The temperature that they test materials at is far too low from what a real fire burns like.
When will we see actual change? Because the next stage of the report could be another year and a half. Then you've got to go through legislation. I mean, it's years away, isn't it? Years.
That was always going to be the problem when there was an inquiry set up that felt like it was kicked into the long grass. And there are some questions about the nature of inquiries. You know, in America, you've got sort of select committee style. People are hauled in, they're interrogated in public. And in a sense, I would have liked to have seen something a bit more like that. But we are where we are. We've got a second phase. There are issues with lawyers' access to question people in that second phase, and there are important vested interests, powerful companies with lots of money for lawyers, a local authority with big reserves, and government ministers in this government and previous ones who are in the frame.
Well, is your party going to promise anything that will change anything on the, in this election? That's the people's chance to try and make some change, isn't it?
Look, I would obviously expect to see the Labour Party say some big things in relation to housing, public housing and social housing, and that's because we've got a leader who at least has a background of raising housing issues over 30 years in Parliament. But I don't want to be that partisan about this. This is a palpable failure. A failure on social housing, a failure to protect poor people in state housing.
We're missing the point here. This is every type of high-rise building. It doesn't matter what your tenure is. Grenfell was a social building, but that could have easily happened in one of the 250 private buildings where people have spent a load of money buying those flats. This isn't a tenure issue. This is a type of building issue. And the more we talk about tenures and one individual material and what happened on the night with the fire brigade, all of that is missing the point.
So what do they need to grip?
They need to get a grip of the whole system, starting from the test regime that allows materials to be tested on a computer model without doing it in the real world, which is insane.
I'm just going to push back slightly. No sprinklers, no alarms, Fire doors that didn't work. I'm sorry, in a fancy penthouse in Chelsea, this would not have happened.
All of the fire doors, if they're made of GRP, every single one of those in the country fails, regardless of the tenure of the people living behind it. If you keep it as a class issue, you are going to miss the big point. This is a building safety issue that should be dealt with for the benefit of everybody going to sleep at night, not just some people.
Of course it's for the benefit of everybody, I accept that. But it's absolutely clear that decisions were made in relation to that building for which the tenants complained and they were totally ignored.
I'm not trying to defend the individual council, but if we stick to it as a tenure thing, we are going to miss the point, and there will be people who will die in this country because they happen to be able to afford to buy their own home. It's a bloody ridiculous situation.
We
need to get past the party politics.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining me, David Lammy and Lord Porter.